Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that explores the darkest corners of human emotion. Jealousy, obsession, and the devastating consequences of love turned toxic. This is the story of Mark Van Dongen, a young man whose life was forever altered by someone who claimed to love him. So as we settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you through this heartbreaking tale. Bristol, England, a city of bridges and hills, where the River Avon winds through historic neighborhoods and university students mingle with professionals in cozy pubs. It was here, in 2010, that two people met through the kind of modern connection that's become so common in our digital age: an online dating website. Mark Van Dongen was 24 years old, a Dutch engineer who had come to England seeking opportunity and adventure. He was tall, handsome, with an easy smile that made people feel comfortable around him. Those who knew him described him as gentle, perhaps even a bit reserved. He was the kind of person who kept his troubles to himself, who didn't make waves, who tried to see the best in people.
Erlina Wallace was 37 when they met, 13 years his senior.
A South African woman studying fashion design at the University of the West of England. She carried herself with a certain intensity. She had been living in Bristol for some time, building a life far from her homeland. The dating website they'd met on wasn't just any platform. It was specifically designed for people living with HIV, a diagnosis that both Mark and Berlina shared. For many people living with HIV, such websites offer not just romance but understanding, a space where they don't have to fear judgment or rejection based on their health status. Their relationship began like many others do, with hope, with possibility. Mark was working as an engineer, methodical and precise in his professional life. Berlina was creative, working toward her degree, envisioning a future in fashion. On the surface, they seemed different enough to be complementary. But as anyone who's lived through a difficult relationship knows, what seems complementary at first can become combustible over time. They moved in together. For 5 years, they built what looked like a life. Mark provided not just companionship, but financial support. He was the steadier one, the anchor, but beneath the surface of their domestic routine, something darker was growing. The colleagues who worked alongside Mark at his engineering firm began to notice things. Small things at first, the kind of details that might seem insignificant in isolation, but that start to form a pattern when you step back and look at the whole picture. Scratches on his arms, marks on his face, the kinds of injuries that would make someone ask, "What happened?" And Mark, being Mark, would brush it off. An accident, nothing serious. The kind of deflection that people who are trying to protect someone or themselves become very good at. But the truth, as it so often does in cases like this, was more troubling. Berlina Wallace was intensely jealous. Possessive, the kind of jealousy that doesn't just question where you've been or who you've been with, but that erupts into violence. During arguments, she would scratch him, strike him. Once, during a particularly heated fight, she had poured boiling water on him. Scalding water, the kind that leaves burns, that leaves scars. Think about that for a moment. The person who supposedly loves you, who shares your bed and your home, deliberately causing you pain. And yet Mark stayed. Why do people stay in relationships like this? It's a question that's been asked thousands of times, and the answer is never simple. Sometimes it's hope, hope that things will get better, that this isn't who the person really is. Sometimes it's fear, fear of what might happen if you leave. Sometimes it's simply exhaustion, the emotional depletion that comes from constantly walking on eggshells, where leaving feels like it would take more energy than staying. By the summer of 2015, something had shifted in Mark. Maybe he'd reached his limit. Maybe he'd glimpsed what life could be like without the constant tension. Or maybe, and this is what ultimately led to the tragedy, he'd met someone else. Her name was Violet. She was a nurse, someone whose profession involved caring for others, easing suffering. Mark had fallen for her. And more importantly, he'd realized that what he'd been living through with Berlena wasn't love. Not the kind of love that should exist between partners. Not the kind that builds you up rather than tears you down. In August 2015, Mark finally did what he'd perhaps been building toward for months or even years. He told Berlena that he was leaving, that their relationship was over, that he'd met someone new. For some people, the end of a relationship, even a painful one, eventually becomes a doorway to healing. For Berlena Wallace, it became something else entirely. It became an obsession. She refused to accept it. She couldn't accept it. In her mind, if she couldn't have Mark, then no one could. September 2nd, 2015. A Wednesday. Just an ordinary day in Bristol for most people. Students heading to lectures, workers commuting to offices. The rhythms of everyday life continuing as they always do. But on this day, Berlena Wallace walked into a shop and made a purchase that would change everything. She bought a liter of sulfuric acid. Not just any acid, but 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. One of the most corrosive substances you can legally purchase. The kind of acid that's used in industrial settings, that requires careful handling, that can burn through metal and flesh with equal efficiency. This wasn't an impulsive purchase. It wasn't a moment of madness where someone acts without thinking. No. This was calculated. Deliberate. Because before September 2nd, before she walked into that shop, Berlena Wallace had done her homework. Investigators would later discover that she had made 82 separate searches on her computer about sulfuric acid. 82. Let that number sink in. She researched what it could do to human tissue. She looked up cases where acid had been thrown on people. She studied the injuries that resulted. The burns, the scarring, the permanent disfigurement. She knew exactly what she was buying. She knew exactly what it would do. And she bought it anyway. After the purchase, though, something interesting happened. Mark didn't leave immediately. Despite having ended the relationship, despite having met Violet, he stayed in Berlina's flat. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he was trying to ease the transition. Maybe he simply had nowhere else to go in that moment. Whatever the reason, he was still sleeping there, still under the same roof as someone who had just purchased a weapon specifically designed to destroy him. For 3 weeks, that bottle of acid sat somewhere in Berlina's flat. 3 weeks where she lived with her purchase, with her plan, with her rage. Did she look at it every day? Did she carry it with her, feeling its weight? We'll never know the full extent of what went through her mind during those 21 days, but we know how they ended. It was the early hours of the morning, that liminal time when the world is at its quietest, when most people are in their deepest sleep, when you're at your most vulnerable. Mark Van Dongen was asleep in bed, just a man sleeping, dreaming whatever dreams occupied his mind in those pre-dawn hours. He had no way of knowing what was about to happen. No way to prepare. No way to protect himself. Berlena Wallace entered the room carrying the bottle of sulfuric acid. She stood over him for a moment. How long, we don't know. Long enough to make a choice. Long enough to decide that what she was about to do was what she wanted, what she needed, what he deserved in her twisted logic. And then she poured it over him. Concentrated sulfuric acid doesn't just burn. It destroys. Its exothermic, meaning it generates heat as it reacts with water, including the water in human tissue. It doesn't just touch the surface. It penetrates. It dissolves. It continues burning even after the initial contact. Mark woke up to unimaginable agony. The acid covered his face first, flooding over his eyes, his nose, his mouth. Then it splashed down his body, searing through his skin. The pain would have been beyond anything most of us can imagine. Every nerve ending screaming, the smell of burning flesh, the realization in those first horrific seconds that something catastrophic was happening to him. He screamed. Of course he screamed. But Berlena wasn't done. As Mark writhed in agony, she spoke. Her words would later be recounted in court, and they reveal everything about her state of mind in that moment. If I can't have you, she said, no one can. It's a line that could come from a movie. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real. This was a human being deliberately destroying another human being because she couldn't control him anymore, because he dared to choose his own happiness over her possession of him. Mark somehow managed to get himself out of the flats. Burning, blinded, his entire body screaming with pain. He made it to the street. Neighbors heard his cries. Someone called emergency services. And in what must have been an eternity but was probably only minutes, help arrived. The paramedics who responded that night had seen a lot in their careers. Car accidents, stabbings, overdoses, all the dark possibilities that emergency responders become familiar with. But an acid attack. In Bristol, this was something different, something that would stay with them. Mark was rushed to the hospital. The emergency room doctor who examined him immediately recognized what had happened. The pattern of the burns. The severity, the way the tissue had been dissolved rather than just burned. This was concentrated sulfuric acid, and the injuries were catastrophic. 25% of Mark's body had been burned. To put that in perspective, burns covering more than 20% of the body are considered critical, life-threatening injuries. But the percentage alone doesn't capture the full horror of what had been done to him. His face had been destroyed. The acid had burned away skin, muscle, tissue. His left eye was gone. Not just damaged, but gone. His right eye had been severely damaged as well, leaving him with only partial vision, and that would deteriorate further. His nose, his lips, his ears all bearing the marks of the acid's corrosive path. But the damage didn't stop at his face. The acid had splashed down his body, burning his torso, his arms, his legs. And beyond the visible burns, there was something even more devastating. The trauma, the shock to his system had triggered a cascade of medical complications. Mark fell into a coma. When he emerged 4 months later, the news was crushing. He was paralyzed from the neck down. The acid, the burns, the shock, somewhere in all of that trauma. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with his nervous system. This young man who had worked as an engineer, who had built things, who had used his hands and his mind to create and solve problems. He couldn't move. He couldn't feed himself. He couldn't dress himself. He was entirely dependent on others for every aspect of his care. And then there was the pain. Burn victims often describe the pain as the worst thing about their injuries, surpassing even the disfigurement or disability. Burns don't just hurt in the moment, they continue to hurt as they heal, as nerve endings regenerate, as scar tissue forms and pulls and tightens. For Mark, there was no reprieve. The pain was constant, unrelenting, and would be for the rest of his life. Doctors did what they could. They performed surgeries. They managed infections. They tried to preserve what function they could. At one point, they had to amputate his lower left leg. The damage from the acid, combined with complications from his immobility, had made it necessary. So now he was paralyzed, blind in one eye, nearly blind in the other, disfigured in constant pain and missing a limb. But Mark was conscious. He could think. He could understand what had happened to him. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, he could communicate, though only through the most painstaking method. Unable to move his body, unable to speak clearly, he would use his tongue to spell out letters on his teeth, forming words one agonizing character at a time. His family was there, of course. His father, who had flown in from the Netherlands, spent hours by his bedside. Can you imagine being a parent and seeing your child in such a condition, knowing that this wasn't an accident, wasn't an illness, but something that had been deliberately done to him by someone who'd claimed to love him? Mark had things he wanted to communicate. At one point, using his tongue and teeth method, he spelled out Violet's name, the woman he'd been starting a relationship with, the woman who represented the life he'd been moving toward when all of this happened. What was he trying to say? Was it a message for her? An expression of regret that they'd never get their chance? We can only speculate. But there was something else Mark communicated, something that would echo through the entire case and raise profound questions about suffering, autonomy, and what we owe to people in unbearable circumstances. "Kill me now," he said. Or spelled out laboriously, desperately, "Kill me now." 15 months, that's how long Mark Van Dongen lived after the attack. 15 months of hospitals and surgeries and rehabilitation attempts and pain management that never quite managed the pain. 15 months of looking at his future and seeing nothing but more of the same, or worse, as his remaining vision continued to deteriorate. The doctors were clear with him. This was his new reality. He would never walk again. He would never regain his independence. The pain might lessen somewhat over time, but it would never truly go away. The disfigurement was permanent. He would require round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. For some people facing such circumstances, there's eventually a kind of adaptation. The human spirit is remarkably resilient, and many people with severe disabilities go on to find meaning, purpose, even joy in their lives. But that adaptation requires hope. It requires being able to imagine a future that's worth living for. And for Mark, in those months of suffering, that hope simply didn't. He'd consulted with multiple doctors, specialists who assessed not just his physical condition, but his psychological state. They all reached the same conclusion: Mark was suffering unbearably, and that suffering would continue for the rest of his life. Not just physical suffering, though. That was immense. But psychological suffering, the loss of everything that had made him who he was. His independence, his mobility, his appearance, his future. In the Netherlands, where Mark was from, euthanasia is legal under strict circumstances. In Belgium, just across the border, it's also permitted. The Belgian system requires that multiple physicians independently assess the patient and agree that the suffering is unbearable and without prospect of improvement. It's not a decision made lightly or quickly. Mark applied for euthanasia in Belgium. 3 separate consultants examined him. They assessed his physical injuries, his level of pain, his prognosis, his mental state. They confirmed that he was making the decision with full mental capacity, that he understood what he was choosing, and they agreed. His case met the criteria. His suffering was unbearable. His physical and psychological pain was extreme and permanent. On January 2nd, 2017, 15 months after the attack, Mark Van Dongen died at a euthanasia clinic in Belgium. He was 29 years old. His father was with him at the end. There's something profoundly sad about the fact that the last act of autonomy Mark was able to exercise was choosing when to die, after months of being entirely dependent on others, unable to control even the most basic aspects of his existence. This was the one choice he could still make. Mark's death created a legal complexity that British courts had never quite dealt with before. Berlana Wallace had been arrested shortly after the attack and charged with attempted murder. But now Mark was dead. Did that change things? Could she be charged with murder? On the surface, it might seem straightforward. She attacked him with acid. He died as a result of that attack. Therefore, murder. But there was a complication. Mark hadn't died directly from his injuries. He'd chosen euthanasia, a deliberate act to end his own life. Did that break the chain of causation? Did Mark's choice absolve Berlina of responsibility for his death? The trial began in late 2017, more than 2 years after the attack. Berlina Wallace, now 48 years old, stood accused of murder and of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They presented the evidence of her research. Those 82 searches about sulfuric acid and its effects. They showed that she'd purchased the acid 3 weeks before using it, proving premeditation. They called witnesses who testified about the volatile nature of her relationship with Mark, including the previous incident where she'd poured boiling water on him. They presented her own words. "If I can't have you, no one can." The defense argued that while Wallace had thrown the acid, she hadn't intended to kill Mark, that her intention was to harm him. Yes, to disfigure him perhaps, but not to cause his death. And they argued that Mark's death had been caused by his own decision to seek euthanasia, not by the attack itself. It was a legal argument that raised uncomfortable questions. How much suffering is someone expected to endure before their decision to end that suffering becomes understandable? If someone is injured so severely that they choose death over continued life, is the person who caused those injuries responsible for that death? The jury deliberated. When they returned their verdict, it was nuanced in a way that reflected the complexity of the case. Berlina Wallace was found not guilty of murder, but she was found guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. The legal reasoning was that Mark's decision to seek euthanasia had indeed broken the chain of causation. She had intended to cause him terrible harm, and she had succeeded in that intention, but his death was technically the result of his own action, albeit an action that was a direct response to what she'd done to him. On May 23, 2018, Berlinia Wallace stood before Judge Nicola Davies for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with people who had followed the case, who needed to see how the law would respond to such an act. Judge Davies didn't mince words. She described Wallace's actions as an act of pure evil. She noted the premeditation, the research, the 3 weeks Wallace had lived with that bottle of acid before using it. She spoke about Mark's suffering, about the unimaginable pain he'd endured, about the life that had been stolen from him. The sentence, life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years before she would be eligible for parole. Life imprisonment. It sounds severe, and in many ways it is. The 12 years minimum. For deliberately destroying someone's life. For causing suffering so severe that they chose death. To some it seemed inadequate, to others it was appropriate given that she hadn't been convicted of murder. The case sparked broader conversations, particularly in the UK where acid attacks had been increasing. Unlike some other countries, the UK has relatively lenient laws about purchasing concentrated acids. They're used in various industrial and commercial applications, and until recently there were few restrictions on buying them. After several high-profile cases, including Mark's, there were calls for stricter controls for making it harder for someone to walk into a shop and buy a substance that can be used as a weapon. But beyond the policy discussions, there was a more philosophical question that Mark's case forced people to confront. What do we owe to people who are suffering unbearably? Is choosing death in the face of such suffering an act of despair that we should prevent? Or is it an act of autonomy that we should respect? And when someone causes suffering so severe that death becomes preferable to life, how do we hold them accountable? Mark Van Dongen was 24 years old when he met Berlinia Wallace. He was 29 when he died. 5 years of relationship, 1 moment of violence, 15 months of suffering, and then nothing. What do we make of a case like this? What can we take from it other than horror at what one human being did to another? There's the obvious lesson about domestic violence, about how it escalates, about how the warning signs, the jealousy, the controlling behavior, the previous violence with the boiling water, are there if we know how to see them. About how people, especially men, often don't report domestic abuse because of shame or because they think they should be able to handle it themselves. There's the lesson about how we treat people with disabilities, about how we support them or fail to support them, in finding meaning and quality of life even in drastically changed circumstances, about whether Mark might have made a different choice if he'd had access to better support, better pain management, better prospects for some kind of future worth living. There's the lesson about euthanasia and assisted dying, about autonomy and suffering, about who gets to decide when life is no longer bearable. These aren't easy questions, and Mark's case doesn't provide easy answers. It just forces us to ask them. But maybe the most important thing to take from Mark's story is simply this. He was a real person, not just a case study, not just a news story, not just a cautionary tale. He was someone who went to work, who had friends, who fell in love, who made plans. He was someone's son. He was someone's boyfriend. He was a person with a future that should have unfolded in ways we'll never know because it was stolen from him in the early hours of one September morning. And the person who took that future from him did so not out of sudden rage, not out of passion, not out of a moment's loss of control, but deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge of what she was doing and what the consequences would be. If I can't have you, no one can. Those words reveal a mindset that sees another person not as an autonomous individual with their own desires and choices, but as a possession, an object that exists solely in relation to oneself. And when that object tries to assert its own independence, it must be destroyed. That mindset, that sense of ownership over another person, is at the heart of so much domestic violence, so many of these cases we cover. The details vary, but the fundamental pattern is the same. Someone believes they have the right to control another person's life, and when they lose that control, they lash out in the most destructive way they can imagine. It's been several years now since Mark Van Dongen died. Berlinia Wallace remains in prison, serving her sentence. The flat in Bristol where the attack happened has likely been cleaned, repaired, rented to someone new, who may or may not know what happened there. Life, as it always does, has moved on. But for the people who loved Mark, his father, his family, his friends, Violet, the wound remains. You don't move on from something like this. You don't get over it. You just learn to carry it. There's a photograph of Mark from before the attack. He's smiling, relaxed, just a regular guy enjoying his life. When you look at that photo, knowing what came after, it's almost unbearable. All that potential, all that future, condensed down to one terrible moment. And its aftermath. And this is the reality of these cases we cover. Behind the courtroom drama and the legal arguments and the forensic details, there are real people whose lives are destroyed. Not just the direct victims, but everyone who loved them. Everyone whose life was connected to theirs. Mark Van Dongen deserved better. He deserved to live his life, to choose who he loved, to be free from violence. He deserved to grow old, to fulfill whatever potential he had, to experience all the ordinary joys and sorrows that make up a human life. Instead, he got 15 months of agony and a death that came far too early, all because someone couldn't accept that he had the right to leave. If you're in a relationship where you're afraid, where you're being hurt, where someone is trying to control your every move, please get help. Reach out to friends, family, domestic violence organizations. What happened to Mark was an extreme case, but the pattern that led to it is all too common. The jealousy, the possessiveness, the escalating violence. These things don't get better on their own. They get worse. And if you're the person doing these things, if you're the one who gets jealous, who lashes out, who can't stand the thought of your partner having a life outside of you, please get help. Before you do something you can't take back, before you destroy not just someone else's life, but your own as well. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story about ambition, isolation, and the dark side of pursuing your dreams in the loneliest corners of America. This is the story of Dylan Rounds, a 19-year-old boy with weathered hands and endless determination, who vanished from his farm in the Utah desert on a rainy Saturday in May. Dylan Rounds wasn't your typical teenager. While other kids his age were navigating college dorms and part-time jobs, Dylan was building something entirely his own in one of the most remote places in the American West. He came from Idaho originally, from a family that knew the value of hard work and independence. But Dylan had a vision that was entirely his own. He'd purchased farmland near Lucin, Utah, a place so remote that it barely registers on most maps. Lucin sits in Box Elder County, right on the edge of where Utah meets Nevada, a landscape of endless sagebrush, alkali flats, and sky that stretches forever in every direction. The nearest town of any significance is over an hour's drive away. Out here, your closest neighbor might be miles down a dirt road. And cell phone service is a luxury, not a guarantee. Dylan was preparing his land for his very first crop in the spring of 2022. He was living in a camper van on the property because there was no house, no running water, no real infrastructure at all. Just land, potential, and a young man's dream. The isolation didn't seem to bother him. He'd make trips back to his parents' homes in Idaho when he needed supplies or a proper shower. But mostly he was content out there in that vast emptiness, working from sunrise until the desert heat became unbearable. His parents, Justin and Candace, were used to their son's independent streak. Dylan would call regularly, send photos of his progress, talk about his plans for planting season. They worried, of course, the way any parents would worry about a child living alone in such a remote location. But Dylan was capable. He was strong, resourceful, and he knew how to handle himself. But the desert has its own rules. And out there, in that endless expanse of nothing, there were others who lived by different codes entirely. Saturday, May 28th, 2022, started like any other day for Dylan Rounds. The weather had turned that morning. Rain in the Utah desert is unusual enough to be noteworthy, and Dylan had work to do because of it. He called his grandmother that afternoon. It was the kind of call he'd make regularly, just checking in, letting family know he was all right out there in the middle of nowhere. But this call was brief. Dylan told his grandmother he couldn't talk long because he needed to move his seed truck into the shed. The rain was coming down, and he didn't want his equipment or his precious seed supply getting damaged. It was a mundane concern, the kind of practical problem farmers deal with constantly. Move the truck, protect the investment, keep working toward that first harvest. His grandmother understood. They said their goodbyes, and Dylan went to take care of his truck. That was the last time anyone in Dylan's family heard his voice. When Dylan didn't call the next day, his parents weren't immediately alarmed. Sometimes he got busy, sometimes the cell service was spotty. But when Sunday turned to Monday and Monday turned to Tuesday, with no word at all, concern began to creep in. This wasn't like Dylan. He always checked in. He knew his parents worried. By May 30th, his parents knew something was terribly wrong. They reported him missing to the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office, and the search for Dylan Rounds began. The Box Elder County Sheriff's Office found themselves facing a uniquely challenging investigation. Dylan had vanished from one of the most remote locations in the state, a place where finding evidence was like searching for specific grains of sand in an enormous desert. The landscape itself seemed to swallow secrets whole. Deputies drove out to Dylan's farm, such as it was. They found his camper van, his equipment, his belongings, but no Dylan, no signs of a struggle at first glance. No obvious evidence of what had happened to this young farmer. His truck, the one he'd been planning to move into the shed, was sitting there. His personal items were undisturbed, but Dylan himself had simply vanished, as if the desert had opened up and swallowed him whole. The sheriff's office organized searches. Volunteers combed the sagebrush and alkali flats. They looked in ravines and washes, anywhere a person might have fallen or gotten injured. The working theory, at least at first, was that something had happened to Dylan while he was out working his land. Maybe he'd gotten hurt and couldn't make it back. Maybe he'd gotten disoriented. The desert can kill you in numerous ways, and most of them are cruelly simple. But then the evidence started telling a different story. Living near Dylan in that remote stretch of desert were other people, though near is a relative term out there. One of them was a man named James Brenner, 59 years old that summer, with a past that was considerably darker than the endless Utah sky. Brenner wasn't farming. He was squatting on land nearby, living rough in that wilderness. And he had a history, the kind that follows you like a shadow no matter how far you run. Brenner had a criminal record spanning 40 years. He was a convicted felon, which meant he wasn't legally allowed to possess firearms. This would become important soon. There was another man too, Chase Venstra, 41 years old. Both men had interacted with Dylan in the days before he disappeared. In a place as isolated as Lucin, even passing encounters become significant when someone vanishes. Investigators started asking questions. They talked to Brenner and Venstra. They tried to piece together who had seen Dylan when they'd seen him, what the interactions had been like. And then, 3 weeks after Dylan disappeared, a critical piece of evidence emerged from the landscape itself. Dylan's cell phone was recovered from a nearby pond, Lucin Pond. They called it just a small body of water in that desert expanse. Someone had thrown the phone away, tried to hide it, tried to make sure whatever it contained would never be found. But water, while damaging, doesn't always destroy everything. Forensic specialists can work miracles with damaged electronics. When investigators examined Dylan's phone, they found something that made their blood run cold. There was video on that phone. Time-lapse video, the kind you might record if you're documenting a project over time. Watching clouds move or crops grow, except this time-lapse hadn't captured anything pastoral or peaceful. The video showed a man, and that man appeared to be James Brenner. In the video, he was wearing a shirt stained with blood. His arms bore blood stains too. And he was meticulously cleaning a gun, working methodically to remove evidence from the weapon's surface. The video was 1 minute and 15 seconds long. Just over a minute of damning evidence, captured accidentally, a piece of digital proof that would eventually seal James Brenner's fate. As the investigation deepened, more evidence emerged. Dylan's boots were found, both of them, but not on Dylan's feet. They'd been discarded, hidden, abandoned in the desert. When forensic analysts examined those boots, they found blood. DNA analysis revealed that the blood on one of those boots belonged to Dylan Rounds. But there was more. Mixed with Dylan's DNA was DNA belonging to James Brenner. The two men's biological material had mingled there on that boot. telling a story of violence and proximity of two people whose paths had crossed in the worst possible way. Phone records added another layer to the narrative. On the day Dylan disappeared, his phone had moved through the desert, traveling through the same area where Brenner had been squatting. The digital trail and the physical evidence were beginning to align, painting a picture that grew darker with each new discovery. Investigators also learned something crucial about the dynamic between Dylan and Brenner. According to what Dylan's mother Candace later shared, there had been tension between the two men. The issue was absurdly simple. Brenner had been angry about where Dylan parked his vehicles, in a place as vast as the Utah desert, where there are more square miles of emptiness than there are people. A dispute over parking seems almost absurd, but isolation does strange things to people. Small grievances become magnified. Minor irritations fester into rage. Out there with no one to mediate, no social structures to enforce civility, conflicts can escalate in ways that would never happen in more populated places. Over something as trivial as where a young farmer parked his truck, James Brenner had apparently decided that murder was an acceptable solution. In July 2022, just weeks after Dylan's disappearance, both James Brenner and Chase Venstra were arrested. The charges were gun crimes. Both men, as convicted felons, were prohibited from possessing firearms, yet both had been found with weapons. For the sheriff's office, these arrests served multiple purposes. It got Brenner off the streets while they continued investigating. It applied pressure. It sent a message that they were watching, that they knew something wasn't right. But they didn't have enough yet to charge Brenner with murder. They had suspicious evidence, yes. They had the video, the boots, the phone records, but they didn't have Dylan's body. Without that crucial piece of proof, building a murder case was challenging. Prosecutors like certainty. Defense attorneys can raise reasonable doubt when the victim remains missing. So they waited. They investigated. They built their case piece by piece while Brenner sat in jail on the weapons charges. The months dragged on. Summer turned to fall. Fall to winter. Dylan's parents lived in a terrible limbo, knowing their son was almost certainly dead, but having no closure. No body to bury. No final goodbye. On March 3rd, 2023, nearly 10 months after Dylan vanished, James Brenner was formally charged with aggravated murder and abuse or desecration of a human body. The charging documents laid out the state's case. The video evidence showing Brenner cleaning the gun, blood visible on his clothing. The boots with mixed DNA. The phone records placing both men in the same location. The history of conflict between them. But still, they didn't have Dylan's body. Still, somewhere out in that vast desert, Dylan Rounds lay hidden. His final resting place known only to his killer. Brenner pleaded not guilty. The case moved forward toward trial, and Dylan's family continued their agonizing wait for answers. 2 years and 16 days after Dylan Rounds disappeared, something shifted. On April 9th, 2024, James Brenner apparently decided that holding on to his secrets was no longer worth whatever benefit it might bring him. As part of plea negotiations, Brenner agreed to do something he'd refused to do for 2 years. Tell authorities where Dylan's body was. Deputies from the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office, guided by Brenner's information, went back out into the remote western part of the county, near Lucin, near where Dylan had been building his dream. They searched in an area that had probably been searched before, but now they knew exactly where to look. They found skeletal remains, buried in that remote desert, right on the border between Utah and Nevada. Dylan Rounds had lain for 2 years while the seasons changed above him, and the desert slowly reclaimed everything. The Utah Medical Examiner's office confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Dylan's. He'd been shot. That's how James Brenner had killed him. A gunshot, out there in the isolation where no one would hear, where a young man's voice calling for help would dissipate into the endless sky unheard. On May 15th, 2024, James Brenner stood in Utah's 1st District Court and pleaded guilty. The aggravated murder charge was reduced to second-degree murder. As part of the plea agreement, the charge for desecration of human remains was dismissed. He also pleaded guilty to 2 counts of possession of a firearm by a restricted person. It was an agreement reached between Brenner, the state of Utah, and Dylan's parents. For Justin and Candace Rounds, the plea deal meant finally having answers, finally being able to bring their son home, finally having a place where they could visit him and grieve properly. In July 2024, District Judge Brandon Maynard sentenced James Brenner to serve a minimum of 3 years and a maximum of 30 years in prison for taking a 19-year-old's life over something as petty as a parking dispute, for burying him in the desert like garbage, for putting his family through 2 years of not knowing. Brenner would spend somewhere between 3 and 30 years behind bars. Whether that's justice is something everyone must decide for themselves. Nearly a year after Brenner's guilty plea, in March 2025, the video evidence was finally released to the public. The 1 minute and 15 seconds of footage that had been the convicting piece of evidence, as investigators called it, the proof that had ultimately led to Dylan's body being recovered, and Brenner's confession. The video showed exactly what the charging documents had described. A man who appeared to be James Brenner, blood visible on his shirt and arms, methodically cleaning a firearm. Its chilling footage made all the more disturbing by its mundane quality. This isn't a Hollywood crime scene, it's just a man cleaning a gun. Except that gun had just been used to end a teenager's life. Dylan's phone had captured it all. That time-lapse he'd been running, meant to document his farming progress, accidentally recording the aftermath of his own murder. So the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office later released statistics about the investigation into Dylan Round's disappearance and murder. They'd spent over 5,000 hours on the case. Hundreds of tips had been followed up. Multiple agencies had assisted. The cost, both in terms of resources and emotional energy, had been staggering. But those numbers don't capture the real toll. They don't measure what it did to Dylan's parents, having to wait 2 years to bring their son home. They don't quantify the loss of potential, of all the years Dylan should have had, all the harvests he should have brought in from that farm in Lucin. Dylan's mother, Candace, has spoken about the experience, about the agonizing wait, about the moment they finally got answers. She's talked about the anxiety of the court proceedings, the constant waiting, the way the justice system moves at its own pace, while families are left in limbo. Even with Brenner's guilty plea and sentencing, she said it doesn't necessarily put it to rest. How could it? Your 19-year-old son is still gone. The boy who called his grandmother about moving a truck in the rain. The young man who was brave enough to go out into the desert alone and build a farm from nothing is still dead. The Utah desert near Lucin is unchanged by all of this. The sagebrush still grows. The alkali flats still shimmer in the heat. The sky is still endless. Dylan's farm, such as it was, is probably being reclaimed by the wilderness now. The way the desert takes back everything eventually. In the end, this is a story about isolation and its dangers. It's about how dreams can take you to remote places where you're vulnerable in ways you never imagined. It's about how violence can erupt over the smallest things when there's no civilization to moderate it. It's about a 19-year-old boy who just wanted to be a farmer, and a man who decided that was reason enough for murder. James Brenner will spend years in prison, possibly decades. Eventually, he'll likely die there. A man who wasted his entire life accumulating convictions and violence. But those years won't bring Dylan back. They won't restore the future that was stolen from him on a rainy Saturday in May. Somewhere in Idaho, Dylan's parents keep his memory alive. They've spoken to media, trying to make sure people don't forget their son, trying to make something meaningful come from meaningless loss. They've talked about the importance of persistence in investigations, about not giving up when someone goes missing. And out in Lucin, the desert wind blows across the land. Dylan once hoped to cultivate. The seasons change. The stars wheel overhead at night, brilliant in that remote darkness. The land remembers nothing and everything, the way land always does. This is the story of Dylan Rounds, the young farmer who vanished from the Utah desert. It's a story about the danger of isolation, the randomness of violence, and the terrible fragility of life. It's about how quickly a dream can turn into a nightmare, how a dispute over parking can escalate to murder, how a Saturday phone call to your grandmother can be the last words your family ever hears you speak. Tonight, remember Dylan. Remember the boy with the weathered hands and the big dreams. The teenager who was brave enough to go out into the desert alone. Remember that every missing person is someone's child, someone's beloved, someone who matters. Let the story settle into your thoughts as you drift towards sleep. Let it remind you that life is precious and fragile, that tomorrow is never guaranteed, that we should tell the people we love that we love them, because you never know when a simple phone call about moving a truck might be your last conversation. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a tragic story from Land O'Lakes, Florida. A story about a woman named Samantha Keithley, whose life was cut short in the most devastating way imaginable. This is a case that reminds us how the people we think we know best can sometimes harbor darkness we never see coming. So as we settle in, let me tell you about Samantha. Samantha Keithley was 33 years old in the autumn of 2018. To those who knew her, she was a vibrant presence. A woman who had reinvented herself more than once, always striving to build something better for herself and her children. She had studied nursing, dedicating herself to the care of others, but eventually found her calling in real estate. By that September, she was working as a real estate agent for Keller Williams Realty in Lakeland, Florida, helping families find their dream homes, navigating the complex world of mortgages and open houses with the kind of warmth that put nervous first-time buyers at ease. Samantha's life hadn't been simple or straightforward. Like many of us, she'd had her share of challenges. She'd been married before, and from that previous relationship she had a son, a boy who would grow into a teenager, watchful and protective of his mother. But in 2012, Samantha found love again. She married Kirk Keithley, a sheriff's deputy with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Kirk was 33 at the time, 6 years younger than he would be on the night. Everything fell apart. Kirk Keithley seemed on the surface like a stable choice. He was a law enforcement officer, someone who had dedicated his career to protecting and serving the community. He joined the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office back in June 29, and by all accounts he was a quiet man, reserved, not the type to draw attention to himself. Over his 9 years and 3 months with the department, he'd had only minor infractions. A letter of reprimand in 2016 for misusing communication facilities. And before that in 2011, a letter of counseling for an avoidable traffic crash. These were minor blemishes on an otherwise unremarkable record. Nothing that would make anyone suspect what was to come. Together, Samantha and Kirk built what looked like a typical blended American family. They had 2 daughters together, Olivia, who was 4 years old, and Evelyn, just 2. Kirk also brought a child from a previous relationship into their home. Combined with Samantha's son from her first marriage, they were a household of 6, busy, chaotic in the way all families with young children are, but by most accounts, functional. They lived in a subdivision in Land O'Lakes, a community in Pasco County just north of Tampa. The house sat on Terrazzo Way near Bexley Village Drive, one of those residential developments where neighbors wave to each other while mowing their lawns, where children ride their bikes in cul-de-sacs until the streetlights come on. It was, in other words, the kind of place where tragedy isn't supposed to happen. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary life, something was breaking. Sunday, September 23, 2018, started like any other day for Samantha Keithley. Or perhaps it didn't. Perhaps there had been tension building for weeks, months even. The kind of slow accumulation of resentments and frustrations that couples sometimes don't even realize is poisoning them until it's too late. What we do know is this. By that evening, Samantha was sick. She wasn't feeling well, and more than anything, she just wanted to rest. But Kirk wouldn't let it go. Whatever had been bothering him, whether it was something specific or just the accumulated weight of unnamed grievances, he began to harass her. For 6 hours, he wouldn't leave her alone. Samantha had a close friend, a woman named Kristen Kellen. They'd known each other for years, the kind of friendship where you can text at any hour, where you can say anything without judgment. And that night, as Kirk's behavior became increasingly erratic, Samantha reached for her phone. The first text arrived at 11:50 p.m. Kirk has lost his mind, Kristen. It was a simple statement, but laden with fear and exhaustion. And then in rapid succession, 3 more messages followed. He's literally losing it. He's been harassing me for the last 6 hours, and I've asked him repeatedly to just leave me alone because I'm sick. I just chucked my ring outside. That detail of the ring is striking. Samantha had thrown her wedding ring outside. It was a gesture of finality, of reaching a breaking point. When you throw your wedding ring away, Even in anger, you're saying something profound about the state of your marriage. We don't know exactly what Kirk said or did during those 6 hours. We don't know what specific words were exchanged or what triggered his behavior. But we know that Samantha felt trapped, harassed, desperate for space that wasn't being given to her. At some point that night, Samantha made a decision. She couldn't stay in that house. Not with Kirk in that state. She gathered a few things and left. She drove to a hotel, seeking refuge, seeking space to breathe and think. Perhaps she hoped that a night apart would cool things down, that Kirk would come to his senses, that in the morning they could talk rationally about whatever was wrong. But that's not what happened. Samantha came back home. We don't know exactly when or what made her decide to return rather than stay at the hotel. Perhaps she was worried about the children. Perhaps Kirk called her, made promises, told her things would be okay. Perhaps she simply felt that running away wasn't the answer, that they needed to face this together. Whatever her reasoning, Samantha Keithley returned to the house on Terrazzo Way. The children were home. All 4 of them. Samantha's 14-year-old son Mark was there, along with the 3 younger children. It was late now, past midnight, creeping into the early hours of Monday morning, September 24th. The argument resumed almost immediately. From somewhere in the house, Mark could hear them. His mother's voice. His stepfather's voice. The familiar but always unsettling sound of adults fighting. Words rising and falling. Tension crackling through the walls. For a teenager who had watched his mother navigate the complexities of blended family life. This might have been frightening, but perhaps not entirely unfamiliar. Couples fight. Parents argue. Usually it blows over. But this time, there was a sound that didn't belong. A gunshot. In the terrible mathematics of violence, everything changes in the space between heartbeats. One moment, there are possibilities. Reconciliation, divorce, therapy, separation, any number of futures that don't end in death. And then there's the sound of a gun, and all those possibilities collapse into a single irrevocable reality. Mark didn't hesitate. He ran outside, his heart pounding, terror flooding his system. But before he fled, he saw her, his mother Samantha, bloody and still. He ran to a friend's house down the street and called 911. The 911 recording from that night is heartbreaking to consider. A 14-year-old boy running down a dark street, phone in hand, trying to explain to a dispatcher what he just witnessed. "Oh my God, my stepdad just shot my mom in the head. Please help me." His voice, we can imagine it. Even without hearing the tape shaking, breathless from running, from shock, from the impossible task of putting into words what had just happened. The dispatcher, trained to remain calm, asked for more details. The boy continued. "My stepdad and mom had been arguing for a night, and she went to a hotel and she came back. And I heard them arguing. And I heard a gunshot, and I walked outside and I saw her. She was bloody. And I saw her dead. I saw her dead." 3 words that would change his life forever. 3 words that meant his mother was gone, that his family was shattered, that nothing would ever be the same. The call came into the Pasco County Sheriff's Office just after midnight on September 24th, 2018. Deputies were immediately dispatched to the home on Terrazzo Way. They arrived within minutes, entering a scene that no amount of training can fully prepare you for. Inside the house, in the bedroom, they found 2 bodies. Samantha Keithley, 33 years old, mother of 4, real estate agent, former nursing student, someone's daughter and friend. In the center of her children's world, she lay on the couch, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. And Kirk Keithley, 39 years old, Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputy, father, husband. He lay dead as well, the gun still near him. He had turned it on himself. The 3 younger children, mercifully, had not witnessed the actual shooting. They had been in other parts of the house, shielded by walls and doors from the worst of it. But they were there in that house when their father killed their mother, and then killed himself. And that proximity to violence, even unseen, leaves its own scars. News of the murder-suicide spread quickly through the community. When a sheriff's deputy is involved in such a tragedy, it makes headlines. But this wasn't just a story about law enforcement or domestic violence statistics. This was about real people whose lives intersected with those of countless others. Kristen Kellen, Samantha's friend who had received those desperate text messages just hours before the murder, spoke to reporters in the days that followed. She was devastated, grappling with guilt and grief in equal measure. Had there been something she could have done? Should she have called the police when she got those texts? Should she have driven to the house? Kirk was a quiet guy, but he wasn't irrational, she told the media. Everybody has problems, but not anything that would cause him to shoot her in the head. He was a very quiet person. I can't believe he did this. That phrase, I can't believe he did this, echoes through so many of these cases. Friends and family of perpetrators almost always express shock, disbelief. How could the person they knew, the quiet man, the dedicated officer, the father of small children, commit such an act? But that's the insidious nature of domestic violence. It often hides behind closed doors, behind the facade of normalcy. The abuse, emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical, escalates gradually in private, away from the eyes of friends and colleagues. By the time it becomes visible to outsiders, it's often too late. Sheriff Chris Naco of Pasco County addressed the media, his face drawn with the weight of what had happened. The children, he confirmed, were safe. They hadn't been physically harmed, but the psychological trauma they would carry, that was another matter entirely. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, where Kirk had worked for more than 9 years, released a statement confirming his employment and his disciplinary record. The 2 minor infractions, the misuse of communication facilities, the traffic accidents, suddenly took on new significance in hindsight. Were they signs of deeper issues, or just normal mistakes that any employee might make over the course of 9 years? There would be an investigation. Of course, the Pasco County Sheriff's Office would examine every detail, trying to construct a timeline, trying to understand how an argument escalated to murder. But some questions don't have satisfying answers. In the days following her death, Samantha's family held a funeral. Her uncle, speaking to the gathered mourners, urged them to honor Samantha's life by living their own lives to the fullest. It was a call not to be consumed by the darkness of how she died, but to remember how she lived. Samantha had been a person of reinvention and resilience. She'd pursued education in nursing, showing her desire to care for others. When that path didn't work out as planned, she'd pivoted to real estate, finding success in a competitive field. She'd navigated the challenges of being a single mother, then a stepmother, then a mother again. She'd built friendships that lasted. She'd sent text messages in her darkest moment, reaching out for help, for connection, for someone to bear witness to what she was experiencing. That perhaps is one of the most important things to remember about Samantha Keithley. She tried to get help. She texted her friend. She left the house and went to a hotel. These were actions of someone who recognized danger, who was attempting to protect herself. But the sad reality is that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for victims of domestic violence. Statistics consistently show that the risk of homicide increases significantly when a victim tries to leave or has recently left an abusive partner. A GoFundMe account was established to help support the 4 children who had been orphaned by their parents' deaths. The community rallied, contributing what they could, but no amount of money could fill the void left by Samantha's absence. Mark, the 14-year-old who had made that desperate 911 call, would have to carry the memory of that night for the rest of his life. The 3 younger children, Olivia, 4 years old, Evelyn, 2 years old, and Kirk's child from his previous relationship, they would grow up with fragments of memory and the stories others told them about the mother and father they lost. The murder of Samantha Keithley is not an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger, more disturbing pattern of domestic violence in America. Every day, on average, more than 3 women are murdered by their husbands or boyfriends in the United States. These deaths often follow a similar pattern: escalating control, isolation, psychological abuse, and finally, lethal violence. Law enforcement officers, despite their training in recognizing and responding to domestic violence in others, are not immune to being perpetrators themselves. Some studies suggest that rates of domestic violence may actually be higher in law enforcement families, though the data is complicated by underreporting and the protective culture that can exist within police departments. Kirk Keithley had access to firearms through his job. He knew how to use them. He understood the criminal justice system. These factors may have made Samantha feel even more trapped, more afraid to seek help through official channels. The text messages Samantha sent to her friend, those desperate pleas for understanding and support. They represent a crucial moment. She was reaching out, but reaching out via text message at 11:50 p.m. on a Sunday night. What could her friend reasonably do? Call the police? On what grounds that her friend's husband was losing it and harassing her? Without witnessing violence firsthand, without a direct threat, what action could be taken? These are the impossible calculations that friends and family of domestic violence victims face. The desire to help, balanced against uncertainty about what's appropriate, what's effective, what might make things worse. One of the most haunting aspects of the Samantha Keithley case is what we don't know. We don't know the content of those 6 hours of harassment. We don't know if Kirk had been abusive before, and if so, for how long. We don't know what he said to Samantha to convince her to come back from the hotel. We don't know what was said in that final argument before he pulled the trigger. The investigation by the Pasco County Sheriff's Office would try to fill in some of these blanks. But ultimately, when both parties are dead, the complete truth dies with them. We're left with fragments, text messages, 911 recordings, witness statements from children who were in the house but not in the room, accounts from friends who knew the couple but didn't know everything that happened behind closed doors. What we do know is this. On September 23, 2018, a 33-year-old woman was frightened enough of her husband to text a friend to leave her home to seek refuge in a hotel. And when she came back, whether out of concern for her children, or hope that things could be resolved, or simply exhaustion, she was killed. We know that 4 children lost both parents in a single night. We know that a community was left grappling with shock and grief. We know that friends like Kristen Kellen would spend the rest of their lives wondering if there was something they could have done differently. And we know that Samantha Keithley's story, tragic as it is not unique. It's a story that plays out with horrifying regularity across the country, in cities and suburbs and rural towns, among people of all races and religions and socioeconomic backgrounds. Looking back at the Samantha Keithley case, there are elements that appear in many domestic violence situations that end in homicide. Understanding these warning signs doesn't bring Samantha back, but it might help save someone else's life. The escalation, Kirk's behavior on that Sunday night, 6 hours of harassment, unable to leave Samantha alone when she was sick. This represents escalating control and aggression. When a partner becomes increasingly unable to respect boundaries or allow their significant other space and autonomy, it's a dangerous sign. The victim's fear, Samantha's text message, Kirk has lost his mind, shows that she recognized something was wrong. That Kirk's behavior had crossed a line into something frightening. When someone in a relationship expresses fear of their partner, that fear should be taken seriously. Access to weapons. Kirk was a law enforcement officer with access to firearms. The presence of guns in a domestic violence situation dramatically increases the risk of homicide. Studies show that when an abusive partner has access to a gun, the risk of homicide increases by 500%. Attempted separation. Samantha went to a hotel, trying to put physical distance between herself and Kirk. This act of trying to leave or create separation is statistically the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. The majority of domestic violence homicides occur when the victim is attempting to leave or has recently left. Obsessive behavior. The fact that Kirk couldn't or wouldn't leave Samantha alone for 6 hours, even when she was sick, suggests an obsessive quality to his behavior, an inability to accept her autonomy or her need for space. None of these signs, individually or together, make violence inevitable. Many relationships have conflicts. Many couples argue, but when these elements combine, especially fear, escalation, and access to weapons, the risk increases dramatically. In the weeks and months after September 23, 2018, the 4 children would have to begin the impossible process of healing. Mark, the oldest, had the burden of being the one who saw, who called 911, who had to describe to a dispatcher what he'd witnessed. How does a 14-year-old process that kind of trauma? The younger children, Olivia Avalon and the other child from Kirk's previous relationship, they would grow up with gaps in their memories. The 2-year-old would likely have no direct memory of her mother at all, only knowing Samantha through photographs and stories told by others. The 4-year-old might have fragmented recollections, images and feelings in moments that become hazier with each passing year. All of them would have to navigate the complicated reality of their father being both a victim in the sense that he took his own life, suggesting he was in profound psychological distress, and a perpetrator having murdered their mother. How do children make sense of that duality? How do they remember and relate to a father who did something so terrible? There would be therapy. Certainly. Trauma specialists, grief counselors, perhaps support groups for children who had experienced similar losses. But no amount of professional help can erase what happened. The best that can be hoped for is that these children find ways to integrate this trauma into their lives without being completely defined by it. The family members who took the children in, we can only imagine the weight they carried. Suddenly responsible, not just for the practical care of 4 children, but for helping them navigate this incomprehensible loss, answering impossible questions, providing stability when their world had been shattered. Perhaps the most persistent question in cases like this is why? Why did Kirk Keithley, a quiet man with only minor disciplinary issues at work, someone who friends said wasn't irrational, suddenly commit such a violent act? What was going through his mind during those 6 hours when he was harassing Samantha? What drove him to pull the trigger? Mental health issues? Perhaps. But mental illness alone doesn't explain domestic violence or murder. The vast majority of people with mental health conditions are not violent, and there's no indication that Kirk had been diagnosed with or treated for any psychological disorder. Stress? Kirk's job as a sheriff's deputy was undoubtedly stressful. Law enforcement officers deal with trauma, violence, and human suffering on a regular basis. The cumulative toll of that exposure can be significant. But again, most police officers don't murder their spouses. Control? This seems more likely. Domestic violence is fundamentally about power and control. When Samantha tried to assert her autonomy, first by asking to be left alone when she was sick, then by throwing her ring outside, then by leaving for a hotel, Kirk may have felt that control slipping away, and for some people, particularly those with deep-seated issues around control and masculinity, that loss of control can trigger rage. Desperation? Kirk killed himself after murdering Samantha. Was he in the grip of some kind of suicidal crisis that expanded to include taking Samantha with him? A murder-suicide represents a particular kind of violence. One that says, if I can't have this life, if I can't have you, then neither of us will have anything. The truth is probably some combination of factors. Psychological, situational, relational, cultural. Kirk Keithley was likely dealing with multiple stressors and likely had beliefs and attitudes about relationships, gender, and control that, when combined with access to a firearm and an escalating conflict, created a perfect storm of violence. But understanding factors that contribute to violence is different from excusing it. Whatever Kirk was experiencing, whatever pain or anger or desperation he felt, nothing justified what he did. He had choices. He could have left the house himself. He could have called in sick to work and checked himself into a mental health facility. He could have called a friend, a counselor, a crisis line. He could have done any number of things that didn't involve murder. Instead, he made a choice that ended Samantha's life, traumatized his children, and destroyed multiple families. Let's return, for a moment, to Samantha herself. In her final hours, she was sick, exhausted, and frightened. She reached out for help in the way she could, texting a friend, seeking temporary refuge in a hotel. These were acts of survival instinct, of recognizing danger and trying to escape it. When she returned to the house, she may have hoped that Kirk had calmed down. She may have felt obligated to check on her children. She may have thought they could talk things through, that the argument could be resolved. We don't know what Samantha's last thoughts were. We don't know if she had a moment of realization before Kirk fired the gun, if she tried to run, if she pleaded with him, or if it happened so quickly she had no time to react. What we do know is that her life mattered, that she was more than just a victim in a crime story. She was a woman with aspirations and friendships, and a career she was building. She was a mother who loved her children. She was someone who studied nursing because she wanted to help people, who moved into real estate and found ways to connect with clients and make them feel at ease during one of the most stressful processes of their lives. Samantha Keithley deserved to live. She deserved to see her daughters grow up. She deserved to watch her son graduate from high school. She deserved to age and change and continue becoming whoever she was meant to be. That future was stolen from her on September 23, 2018, in a house in Land O'Lakes, Florida, by someone who was supposed to love her. The house on Terrazzo Way still stands. Life in Land O'Lakes continues. The subdivision where the Keithley family lived still has children riding bikes in the cul-de-sacs, still has neighbors waving to each other while mowing their lawns. But for the 4 children who survived that night, life will never be the same. They carry with them the weight of what happened. The knowledge that violence can erupt in the places we're supposed to feel safest. That the people we're supposed to trust most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us. Kristen Kellen, Samantha's friend, likely still has those text messages on her phone. Kirk has lost his mind. Words that now read like a prophecy, a warning that came too late to change anything. The deputies who responded to the 911 call that night, who entered the house and saw the bodies, who had to secure the scene and comfort traumatized children. They carry their own memories of that night. And somewhere, hopefully, the Keithley children are finding moments of peace and joy. Hopefully, they're getting the support they need. Hopefully, they're building lives that are defined not by what they lost, but by what they choose to create going forward. The murder of Samantha Keithley is a tragedy, but it's also a reminder that domestic violence can happen anywhere, to anyone. A reminder that we need to take seriously when friends or loved ones express fear of their partners. A reminder that the time when someone tries to leave an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time, and that's when they need the most support and protection. If Samantha's story can serve any purpose, let it be this: that we learn to recognize the warning signs, that we create systems and support networks that make it safer for people to leave abusive relationships, that we take seriously the fear and desperation in late-night text messages from friends. Because somewhere tonight, someone else is texting a friend saying their partner has lost their mind. Someone else is fleeing to a hotel, hoping that distance will keep them safe. Someone else is trying to decide whether to go back home or stay away. And maybe, just maybe, if we pay attention, if we act, if we believe victims when they tell us they're afraid, we can prevent the next tragedy. We can save the next Samantha Keithley. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You don't have to face this alone. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that unfolded in the quiet coastal community of San Diego, California. A story about a marriage that crumbled behind closed doors, about secrets kept in the dark, and about a woman named Elizabeth Sullivan, who simply wanted to start over. This is a story that begins with a disappearance, and ends with a discovery that would shock everyone who knew the couple. So let me take you through the tragic case of Elizabeth Sullivan. In 2014, Liberty Station in San Diego was home to many military families. Among them were Matthew and Elizabeth Sullivan, a couple who from the outside seemed to have it all figured out. Matthew was a Navy sailor, dedicated to his service, while Elizabeth, known to her friends as Liz, was a vibrant young mother of 2 daughters aged 4 and 2. Liberty Station itself had an interesting history. Once the Naval Training Center San Diego, it had been transformed into a mixed-use neighborhood with townhomes, parks, and shops. The Sullivans lived in one of these modern townhomes, a place that should have been filled with the sounds of children laughing and a family growing together. But behind the door of their residence, things were far from perfect. By the fall of 2014, the Sullivan marriage had deteriorated significantly. They were no longer sharing a bed. In fact, they weren't even sleeping on the same floor of their home. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, a chasm that had grown so wide that it seemed impossible to bridge. Elizabeth was 32 years old. That October, she had dreams, aspirations beyond the life she was living. Those who knew her described her as someone with an impulsive streak. Yes, but also someone who was warm, caring, and deeply devoted to her 2 little girls. She was the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in. Someone who made friends easily and kept them close. Matthew, on the other hand, was more reserved, quieter. He was dedicated to his work in the Navy, a man who seemed to pride himself on control and order. But beneath that calm exterior, tensions were building. tensions that would soon explode in the worst possible way. In September 2014, just weeks before everything fell apart, Elizabeth began an extramarital affair. The relationship developed quickly, the way these things sometimes do when someone is desperately unhappy at home. The man's name would later come up in court testimony, evidence of just how far the marriage had unraveled. For Elizabeth, this affair may have represented hope, a chance at happiness, a glimpse of what life could be like if she could just break free from the relationship that was slowly suffocating her. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially in a marriage where trust has already been shattered. Matthew discovered the affair. The exact moment isn't clear. Perhaps he found a text message. Maybe noticed the way Elizabeth's demeanor had changed. Or perhaps someone told him directly. But he knew, and that knowledge, combined with everything else that had gone wrong between them, created a volatile situation. The couple's arguments intensified. Neighbors might have heard raised voices, might have sensed the tension emanating from that townhome in Liberty Station, but no one could have predicted what was about to happen. On October 13th, 2014, Elizabeth took a step that many unhappy spouses eventually take. She met with a divorce attorney. It was a Monday, an ordinary day in most respects, but for Elizabeth it was the beginning of the end, though not in the way she hoped. During that meeting, she discussed her options, talked about custody of her daughters, about splitting assets, about all the practical matters that come with ending a marriage. She scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next day, October 14th. She planned to go back to the attorney's office to continue the process of legally separating her life from Matthew's. She would never make that appointment. October 13, 2014. That evening is when everything came to a head. Elizabeth was at home with Matthew and their two young daughters. The girls were in their room, likely getting ready for bed, doing the ordinary things that children do. Brushing teeth, putting on pajamas, maybe asking for one more story before lights out. But in another part of the house, Elizabeth and Matthew were arguing. This wasn't unusual for them by this point. But this argument was different. The intensity was different. The stakes were different. At some point during the evening, Elizabeth called a friend named Duckett, someone she trusted, someone who knew about the problems in her marriage. Elizabeth sounded frantic, terrified even. In the background, Duckett could hear the argument continuing, could hear Matthew's voice, could sense that something was very wrong. Elizabeth's last words to her friend that night would haunt Duckett for years to come. Then the line went dead, or the call ended. We don't know exactly how it concluded, but what we do know is that it was the last time Duckett or any of Elizabeth's friends would speak to her alive. Later that night, around 11:30 p.m., Elizabeth sent a text message to another friend in Virginia. It was brief, casual even. Just checking in, staying connected the way friends do. Her phone was turned off shortly after that message was sent. The digital trail ended there. What happened in those dark hours of October 13, stretching into the early morning of October 14, would remain a mystery for a long time, but the evidence would eventually tell a horrific story. In Elizabeth's bedroom, the room where she had been sleeping alone, separated from her husband, a violent confrontation took place. Matthew came at her with rage that had been building for months. He beat her, and then he stabbed her, multiple times, with enough force that the blade damaged her bones. Elizabeth's jaw was broken. The stab wounds pierced deep into her body. This wasn't a crime of passion in the sense of a momentary loss of control. This was sustained violence. This was rage and hatred, and the desire to eliminate someone who had become, in his mind, a threat to whatever life he wanted to preserve. And their daughters, those two precious little girls aged 4 and 2, were in the next room. Perhaps they were asleep. Perhaps they heard something and wondered what the sounds meant. Perhaps they called out for their mother in the darkness and received no answer. Elizabeth died in that bedroom. The woman who had just that day been planning her future, who had been imagining a life free from this troubled marriage, who had been thinking about her daughters and how to protect them through a divorce. She died on the floor of her own bedroom while her children slept nearby. When the sun rose on October 14, 2014, Elizabeth Sullivan was gone. But according to Matthew, she had simply left, walked out, abandoned her family. He told anyone who would listen that Elizabeth was impulsive, that she had a history of making rash decisions, that it wasn't completely surprising she would just pack a suitcase and disappear. He painted a picture of an unstable woman, someone who might very well decide on a whim to start a new life somewhere else. Elizabeth's friends and family didn't believe it. Not for a second. Elizabeth loved her daughters fiercely. She would never have left them no matter how unhappy she was in her marriage. She would have fought for custody, would have worked out a co-parenting arrangement, would have done anything to stay in their lives. Just abandoning them? Impossible. A missing person report was filed. The San Diego Police Department began investigating. They searched the area around Liberty Station. They followed up on leads. They interviewed Matthew, who maintained his story about Elizabeth leaving voluntarily. He even gave interviews to the media, including one with People magazine in November 2014. In that interview, Matthew played the role of the distraught husband perfectly. "I'm at the end of my rope," he told the reporter. "I'm running on fumes right now. I don't know where to look." He spoke about how hard it was not knowing where his wife was, how difficult it was for his daughters to be without their mother. It was a convincing performance. But it was exactly that, a performance. The police searched the Sullivan home, but found no immediate signs of foul play. There was no body, no obvious blood evidence at first glance. Nothing to contradict Matthew's story that Elizabeth had simply walked away from her life. The case began to go cold. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Elizabeth's family kept hoping, kept praying that she would turn up somewhere, that maybe Matthew's story was true and she would come back. But deep down they knew. They knew something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Matthew went on with his life. He continued his duties with the Navy. He took care of his daughters. He maintained the house at Liberty Station. And in the garage of that house, in a chest freezer, Elizabeth's body remained hidden, frozen in time. 2 years passed. 2 long years of Elizabeth's family not knowing where she was, of her daughters growing up without their mother, and investigators periodically returning to the case, but finding no new leads. Matthew had eventually moved out of San Diego. He relocated to Maryland first for military duty, and then after leaving the Navy, he settled in Wyoming, Delaware, where he started building a new life far from California, and far from the questions about his missing wife. But on October 6, 2016, almost exactly 2 years after Elizabeth vanished, a body was discovered in San Diego Bay. The location wasn't far from Liberty Station, not far from where the Sullivan family had once lived. The body had been in the water, and the ocean had not been kind to it, but investigators were able to recover it and begin the process of identification. When the medical examiner completed the autopsy, the findings were chilling. The body was Elizabeth Sullivan. She had been stabbed multiple times with a sharp object. The stab wounds were so deep and violent that they had damaged her bones. Her jaw was broken. The injuries told the story of a brutal attack, of someone who had been killed with tremendous force and rage. But there was something else. Something that made this case even more disturbing. The condition of the body suggested it had been frozen for a significant period before being placed in the water. The decomposition pattern wasn't consistent with a body that had been in the bay for 2 years. The marine life damage, the way the tissues had degraded, everything pointed to the body having been preserved somehow before being dumped. The theory that would eventually emerge was horrifying in its calculated cruelty. Elizabeth had been killed in October 2014, and her body had been stored in the freezer in the garage of the Liberty Station home. Matthew had kept her there, frozen, while he went about his daily life, while he took care of their children, went to work, interacted with neighbors, gave interviews about his missing wife. All the while Elizabeth was in that freezer just steps away. And then when Matthew was preparing to move out of San Diego in October 2016, he needed to dispose of the evidence. He couldn't take a body with him across state lines. So he took Elizabeth's frozen remains and dumped them in the bay, likely weighted down to keep her submerged. But the weights didn't hold, or perhaps they came loose. The ocean has a way of revealing secrets, of bringing hidden things to the surface, and that's exactly what happened. Elizabeth's body surfaced, was found, and suddenly the investigation into her disappearance became a murder investigation. With Elizabeth's body recovered and identified, investigators returned to the Liberty Station townhome with renewed purpose. They weren't looking for signs that someone had left voluntarily anymore. They were looking for evidence of murder, and they found it in Elizabeth's bedroom, the one where she had been sleeping separately from her husband. Forensic investigators discovered blood, not on the surface where anyone could see it, but soaked into the carpet, into the padding beneath the carpet, and even into the wooden floorboards below. Someone had tried to clean up, had tried to hide what had happened there. But blood has a way of seeping deep, of leaving traces that are almost impossible to completely erase. The blood was tested. It was Elizabeth's. Investigators kept searching. In the attic, tucked away where no one would think to look, they found a knife. It had traces of blood on it. That blood, too, was Elizabeth's. The murder weapon had been hidden in the house all along. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. The evidence told a clear story. Elizabeth had been killed in her bedroom, beaten and stabbed to death. Her blood had soaked into the floor of her own home. The knife used to kill her had been hidden in the attic, and her body had been stored in the garage freezer for nearly 2 years, before being dumped in San Diego Bay just as Matthew was preparing to leave California. The motive was equally clear. Elizabeth had been having an affair, which Matthew had discovered. She had met with a divorce attorney on October 13, 2014, the day she died. She was planning to leave him, to take his daughters, to dismantle the life he thought he had, for a man who valued control, who had built his identity around being a Navy sailor with a family. This was intolerable. The prosecution would later argue that Matthew killed Elizabeth in a rage, after finding out she was serious about divorcing him, that he couldn't handle the thought of losing control of his family, of being left, of having to split custody of his daughters. So he eliminated the problem. He killed his wife, hid her body, and then played the part of the concerned husband for 2 years while he figured out what to do next. On January 31, 2018, more than 3 years after Elizabeth died, Matthew Sullivan was arrested at his home in Wyoming, Delaware. He was charged with the murder of his wife and extradited back to San Diego to face trial. Matthew maintained his innocence throughout. "No, absolutely not. That's crazy," he said when asked if he killed Elizabeth. "I've never laid a finger on her, even from behind bars, even with all the evidence mounting against him." He stuck to his story. His trial began on February 21, 2020. It had taken 6 years since Elizabeth's disappearance for the case to finally go before a jury. 6 years of waiting for her family, 6 years of questions, 6 years of his daughters growing up without knowing the full truth about what happened to their mother. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Jill Lindbergh, laid out their case methodically. They presented the blood evidence from the bedroom. They showed the jury the knife that had been hidden in the attic. They explained how the condition of Elizabeth's body indicated it had been frozen before being placed in the water. It detailed the timeline of the affair, the divorce attorney meeting, the argument on the night of October 13th. They argued that Matthew had beaten and stabbed Elizabeth to death in their home while their young daughters slept in the next room, that he had then placed her body in the freezer and kept it there for nearly 2 years, that when he needed to move out of San Diego in October 2016, he had finally disposed of the body by dumping it in the bay. The defense, led by Attorney DeBose, tried to create reasonable doubts. They argued that the prosecution's theory about the freezer was speculation. They questioned whether there was definitive proof that Matthew had put the body in the bay. They suggested that the evidence, while circumstantial, didn't definitively prove murder. But the jury wasn't convinced by the defense's arguments. The evidence was too overwhelming. The blood in the bedroom, the knife in the attic, the condition of the body, the timeline of events, the motive, all of it pointed to one conclusion. On March 6, 2020, after deliberating, the jury reached a verdict. They found Matthew Sullivan guilty, not of first-degree murder, which would have required proof of premeditation, but of second-degree murder. They believed he had killed his wife, but perhaps in a moment of rage rather than as part of a carefully planned execution. It was a conviction that Elizabeth's family had been waiting 6 years to hear. On March 12, 2021, nearly 7 years after Elizabeth's death, Matthew Sullivan was sentenced. He stood before the judge, still maintaining his innocence, still insisting he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. The judge sentenced him to 16 years to life in prison. 16 years as a minimum, before he would even be eligible for parole. And given the nature of the crime, given the evidence, it seemed unlikely he would ever walk free again. During the sentencing hearing, Elizabeth's family finally had the chance to speak. They talked about the vibrant, loving person she had been. They spoke about the void her absence had left in their lives. They talked about her daughters who had lost their mother when they were just babies, who had grown up with only fragments of memories and photographs to know her by. Those two little girls, who had been 4 and 2 years old when their mother died, were now older. They had lived through the loss of their mother, the arrest of their father, the trial, and now the sentencing. Their lives had been irrevocably changed by what happened in that townhome in Liberty Station on the night of October 13th. Matthew Sullivan was taken away to serve his sentence. He continues to maintain his innocence from prison, continues to claim that he had nothing to do with Elizabeth's death. But the evidence, the jury, and the judge all disagree. The case closed officially, but for Elizabeth's family, there would never really be closure. You can't close the chapter on losing someone you love, especially not in such a violent and senseless way. The murder of Elizabeth Sullivan is a case that raises troubling questions about domestic violence, about the warning signs that are often missed or ignored, and about the lengths some people will go to maintain control. Elizabeth wasn't killed by a stranger. She was killed in her own home, in her own bedroom, by the man she had married, the father of her children. She was killed because she wanted to leave, because she dared to imagine a life beyond a broken marriage. The fact that Matthew allegedly kept her body frozen for 2 years, continuing his daily life, raising their daughters, interacting with family and investigators, all while Elizabeth's remains were in the garage, speaks to a level of compartmentalization and deception that is difficult to comprehend. How does someone do that? How does someone kill their spouse, hide the body, and then play the role of the concerned husband searching for answers? What kind of person can look their children in the eye, knowing what they've done to their mother? These are questions without satisfying answers. The human capacity for violence, for deception, for acting in self-interest above all else. These are dark aspects of our nature that cases like Elizabeth's bring into sharp focus. For the people of Liberty Station, for the community that had watched this case unfold over years, there was a sense of unease. The idea that someone could commit such a crime, hide it so well, and nearly get away with it. It challenged their sense of security, their belief that they could recognize danger when they saw it. Matthew Sullivan had been their neighbor. His daughters had played with their children. He had seemed to most people completely normal. And yet behind closed doors, he had committed an act of horrific violence, and then concealed it with chilling effectiveness. Elizabeth Sullivan was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a mother of 2 precious girls. She had hopes and dreams. She loved dancing, loved spending time with her children, loved her friends and family. Those who knew her remember her smile, her energy, the way she could light up a room. They remember her impulsiveness, yes, but also her warmth and her genuine care for the people in her life. Her death was a tragedy, but her life was meaningful. She touched people. She mattered. And the fact that her case eventually resulted in justice, that Matthew was held accountable for what he did, means that her story wasn't completely lost to the darkness. The case has been featured on various true crime shows, including Dateline NBC, which aired a full episode called Secrets by the Bay in 2023. These programs help ensure that Elizabeth is remembered, that her story is told, that people understand what happened to her. For her daughters, now growing up without either parent, Elizabeth's memory is preserved in photographs, in stories told by family members, in the scattered memories they might have from when they were very young. They will have to carry the weight of what happened, the knowledge of how their mother died and who was responsible for the rest of their lives. But hopefully they will also carry forward the best parts of Elizabeth, her warmth, her energy, her capacity for love. Hopefully they will find a way to build lives that honor her memory. Lives filled with the happiness that she was seeking when her life was cut short. The murder of Elizabeth Sullivan is a reminder that true crime isn't just about mysteries and investigations and courtroom drama. It's about real people, real lives destroyed, real families torn apart. It's about a woman who wanted a divorce and was killed for it. About 2 little girls who lost their mother to violence. About a community shaken by the discovery that evil can live next door and wear a friendly face. Elizabeth Sullivan was 32 years old when she died. She had so much life left to live, so many moments with her daughters that she would never experience. First days of school, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, all of it stolen from her in a moment of rage in that bedroom in Liberty Station. Her body spent 2 years frozen in darkness before being released to the ocean. But her spirit, her memory, the impact she had on the people who loved her, those things can never be frozen, never be hidden away. Those things endure, and now her story has been told. Not just as a cautionary tale or a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder that behind every true crime case is a person who deserved better, who deserved to live, who deserved justice. Elizabeth Sullivan got her justice, eventually. Matthew Sullivan is in prison, and he will likely remain there for the rest of his life. It's not enough justice never really is. When someone has been murdered, but it's something, and so we remember Elizabeth tonight. We remember her life, not just her death. We remember that she was loved, that she mattered, that her story deserved to be told. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Deltona, Florida, where palm trees sway gently in the warm breeze and families go about their daily routines, there exists a story that reminds us how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary facades. This is the story of Yesenia Suarez and her 2 children, a case that would grip Central Florida for years and leave questions that may never be fully answered. Yesenia Yvette Suarez was 28 years old in the fall of 2013. She was a mother, a worker, a daughter, and a woman trying to build a better life for herself and her children. Those who knew her described her as devoted to her family, particularly to her 2 children from a previous relationship. 9-year-old Thalia Otto was a bright young girl with her whole life ahead of her. And 8-year-old Michael Elijah Otto was her younger brother, still in elementary school, still learning about the world around him. The small family lived in a home on Covent Gardens Place in Deltona, a city of about 90,000 people located between Daytona Beach and Orlando. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where children played outside, where life was supposed to be safe and predictable. Yesenia lived there with her husband, Luis Toledo, who had become the stepfather to her children. But beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family life, there were cracks that had been forming for a long time. Luis Toledo was not just a stepfather and husband. He carried with him a past that most suburban families couldn't imagine. Before meeting Yesenia, before settling into domestic life in Deltona, Toledo had risen through the ranks of one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in Florida. He had been the 3rd highest-ranking member of the Latin Kings gang in the entire state. The Latin Kings, for those unfamiliar, is not just a street gang. It's a sophisticated criminal enterprise with roots going back decades, with international connections, with codes and hierarchies and levels of violence that most people only see in movies. For Toledo to have reached such a high position meant he had proven himself in ways that required ruthlessness, loyalty to the organization above all else, and a willingness to do things most people couldn't stomach. His criminal record reflected this life. It was extensive, a paper trail of arrests and charges that painted the picture of a man who had spent years living outside the boundaries of normal society. But like many people with criminal pasts, Toledo had seemingly tried to leave that life behind. He had married Yesenia. He had taken on the role of stepfather. He was, at least on the surface, trying to be a family man. Then, just 1 month before the events that would change everything, Toledo did something that showed his old life wasn't as far behind him as it might have seemed. He became a key witness in a major racketeering trial against the leader of the Florida Latin Kings. He testified against the organization he had once served at the highest levels. He turned state's evidence. This was not a small thing. In the world of organized crime, there are few greater betrayals than cooperating with law enforcement. The code is clear. You don't talk to the police. You don't testify in court. You certainly don't help put your former leader behind bars. But Toledo did exactly that. We'll never know for certain what motivated him to take the stand. Perhaps it was part of a deal to reduce his own legal troubles. Perhaps he was genuinely trying to distance himself from that life. Perhaps there were other factors at play, but what we do know is that this decision would hang over everything that came next. By October of 2013, Yesenia and Luis's marriage was in trouble. This wasn't a secret kept hidden from the world. They had been talking about separating. The conversations had been happening for some time. Friends and family could see the strain between them. Yesenia had found connection with someone else. She had begun a relationship with a coworker, a man she spent time with at her job in Lake Mary, a neighboring city. In today's digital age, secrets are hard to keep, and text messages create permanent records. Phone logs tell stories, and Luis had discovered the affair. We can imagine the anger that must have built in him. Here was a man who had lived a life where respect and loyalty were everything, where betrayal was met with swift and brutal consequences. He had testified against his former gang, breaking their code, perhaps justifying it to himself as necessary. But now his own wife had broken faith with him. The double standard of his thinking may not have occurred to him, or if it did, he didn't care. This was the day when the private turmoil of the Toledo marriage became public, when the first clear warning signs appeared that something was very wrong. That afternoon, Luis Toledo appeared at Yesenia's workplace in Lake Mary. He was angry. He had seen the text messages on her phone, and he wanted answers. What happened next was witnessed by coworkers, making it a matter of public record. Outside the building, Luis and Yesenia argued. Voices were raised. The confrontation escalated, and then Luis struck her, slapping Yesenia in front of her workplace, in broad daylight, where others could see. But Luis wasn't finished. He wanted to speak with Yesenia's bosses. The secretary, perhaps not understanding the situation, buzzed him into the building. Inside, the confrontation continued. Yesenia's co-workers watched uncomfortable and concerned, as this domestic dispute played out in their professional space. Eventually, Luis left. But Yesenia was shaken. She called her family that day, and what she told them would later take on tragic significance. She said she was afraid of Luis. She expressed fear about what he might do. Her family, hearing the worry in her voice, took her concern seriously. That evening, Yesenia went home to the house on Covent Gardens Place. Thalia and Michael were there, 2 children caught in the middle of their mother's troubled marriage, unaware that they were standing on the edge of something terrible. What happened in that house over the next several hours remains, in many ways, a mystery. There were no witnesses who came forward to describe what occurred inside those walls. But neighbors would later report that they heard screaming coming from the Suarez home that night. Screaming that cut through the quiet of the suburban evening that should have prompted calls to the police, but didn't. The next morning came, and with it, silence. When Wednesday morning arrived, something was wrong. Yesenia didn't show up for work. She didn't call, for a woman who had just been assaulted by her husband the day before, who had told her family she was afraid. This absence rang alarm bells immediately. A family member, growing concerned, requested a wellness check. They asked law enforcement to go to the house on Covent Gardens Place to make sure Yesenia and the children were safe. It was exactly the kind of precaution you take when you fear the worst, but hope for the best. Deputies from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office arrived at the home. They knocked on the door. There was no answer. They looked through windows, checked around the property. The house appeared empty, but there was no obvious sign of what had happened. Yesenia had 2 vehicles registered in her name. One was sitting in the driveway of her home, exactly where it should be. But the other, a 2013 Honda Accord, was missing. That same day the Accord was found. It had been left in a parking lot, abandoned. As law enforcement began to investigate more deeply, they discovered something that would become a key piece of the puzzle. Blood had been found inside the home. Not just a small amount either. Crime scene investigators with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement examined the house and found 14 distinct spots of blood that belonged to 9-year-old Thalia. 14 locations where her blood had been spilled inside her own home. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a crime scene. Luis Toledo became the immediate focus of the investigation. Given the confrontation the day before, given the history of the troubled marriage, given his presence in the home, he was the obvious suspect. On October 24th, 2013, just 2 days after the confrontation at Yesenia's workplace, deputies moved to detain Toledo. The arrest itself would later become a point of legal contention. Toledo's defense attorneys would argue that the arrest was illegal, that proper procedures hadn't been followed. They claimed that Volusia County Sheriff's deputies had detained Toledo, then waited for Lake Mary police to arrive to make the formal arrest for the assault at the workplace, before transferring him to the Volusia County Jail. The defense argued this violated Toledo's rights, but regardless of the technical legalities, Toledo was in custody, and investigators began the painstaking work of trying to figure out what had happened to Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael. The evidence they gathered painted a disturbing picture. The blood in the house was the most damning physical evidence, particularly the 14 spots belonging to Thalia. But there was the timeline of that Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning showed that something terrible had occurred during those hours. The abandoned car suggested an attempt to stage a scene or throw off the investigation. And then there were the digital trails. Phone records, text messages, financial records. All of them told a story of a family that had stopped existing in the digital world after Tuesday night. Yesenia, who had been close with her family, never contacted them again. Her bank account showed no activity. Her phone went silent. On October 24th, 2013, law enforcement made a grim announcement. They declared that Yesenia Suarez and her 2 children were dead, and they named Luis Toledo as the prime suspect in their murders. But there was one enormous problem with the case. The bodies had never been found. In the days following his arrest, something extraordinary happened. Luis Toledo, sitting in an interrogation room, made what appeared to be a confession, and it was chilling. Sergeant A.J. Pagliari of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office sat across from Toledo. During the interview, Pagliari did something calculated. He placed photographs on the table between them. 3 photographs. One of Yesenia, one of Michael, one of Thalia. He made Toledo look at the faces of the people he was suspected of killing. Something in Toledo broke, or appeared to break. He began to talk, and what he described was the stuff of nightmares. According to the confession that would later be played in court, Toledo described killing Yesenia in intimate, horrifying detail. "She died looking at me," he said, begging for air. The words painted a picture of strangulation, of a woman's final moments spent looking into the eyes of the man she had married, the man who was now taking her life, pleading silently for mercy that would not come. It was a confession that should have been devastating to his defense, an admission of guilt from his own mouth. But there was a problem. Toledo immediately recanted. He claimed the confession was false, that he had been coerced, that he had said what the investigators wanted to hear, and stranger still, both the prosecution and the defense would eventually agree that the confession wasn't entirely credible. The details Toledo provided didn't match the physical evidence in certain ways. There were inconsistencies that suggested he might have been fabricating details or that his memory of events was impaired or distorted. But perhaps most significantly, Toledo claimed in his confession that he could never reveal where the bodies were. "And I'll never tell you where the bodies are," he reportedly said. And true to his word, if it was his word, the bodies of Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael were never recovered. This created an enormous challenge for prosecutors. How do you prove someone committed murder when you can't even prove definitively that the victims are dead? In most murder cases, the body provides crucial evidence about cause and manner of death, about timeline, about the circumstances of the killing. Without that evidence, the prosecution would have to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence. While the legal proceedings slowly ground forward, the community of Deltona and Yesenia's family were left to grapple with an impossible situation. 3 people had vanished from their lives, and while everyone believed they were dead, there was no closure, no burial, no final goodbye. Yesenia's father traveled to Central Florida when news of his daughter's disappearance broke. Imagine the pain of a father who has lost his daughter and grandchildren, who doesn't even have bodies to mourn over, who must face the reality that somewhere, in an unknown location, his family lies in unmarked graves, or worse. In an unusual move, law enforcement arranged for a meeting between Toledo and Yesenia's father. While Toledo was in custody, the hope was that seeing the devastated father might break through Toledo's silence, might make him reveal where the bodies were hidden. It was a calculated gambit on the part of investigators, an appeal to whatever humanity might remain in the suspected killer. We don't know the details of what was said in that meeting, but we do know the outcome. Toledo still didn't reveal the location of the bodies. From October 2013 to October 2017, nearly 4 years passed. 4 years during which Yesenia's family lived in limbo. 4 years during which legal motions were filed and argued. 4 years during which Toledo sat in jail awaiting trial. The case was complicated. The defense continued to argue that the arrest had been illegal. They filed motions to suppress evidence. They challenged the confession. They argued that without bodies there was no proof that murder had occurred at all. Perhaps, the defense suggested, Yesenia had chosen to disappear. Perhaps she had taken the children and fled to escape her troubled marriage. But the prosecution had their own timeline of evidence. They had the blood in the house. They had the witnesses who had seen the confrontation at Yesenia's workplace. They had Yesenia's statement to her family that she was afraid. They had her sudden and complete disappearance from all aspects of her life. The digital ghost where a living person should be. Most compellingly, they had the fact that Yesenia, who had been extremely close with her family, had not contacted anyone in 4 years. No phone calls, no emails, no social media activity, no financial transactions. For a mother to abandon her children, or for all three of them to vanish so completely without ever reaching out to loved ones, strained credibility to the breaking point. In October of 2017, exactly 4 years after the disappearances, the trial of Luis Toledo finally began. The venue was St. Augustine, Florida, moved from the original jurisdiction to ensure an impartial jury could be seated. The prosecution and defense presented vastly different narratives to the jury of 9 women and 3 men. The state's case was methodical. They laid out a timeline that began with the confrontation on October 22 and ended with 3 people who had ceased to exist in every measurable way. They presented the testimony of Yesenia's former co-worker and lover, the man whose relationship with Yesenia had sparked Luis's rage. This was delicate ground, painting Yesenia as sympathetic, while also acknowledging the affair that had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage. They brought in forensic experts who testified about the blood evidence found in the home, particularly the 14 spots of Thalia's blood scattered throughout the house. They presented phone records and financial documents showing the complete cessation of activity. They played the controversial confession, despite its problems, because even a flawed confession contained admissions that worked against the defendant. The prosecution argued that the motive was clear: rage over the affair, rage over the impending end of the marriage, rage that built up in a man who had lived a life where he was accustomed to having power and control. They argued that on that Tuesday evening, after the confrontation at the workplace, Luis Toledo had returned home and murdered his wife and stepchildren in a fit of anger. The defense, led by attorneys Michael Nielsen and Jeff Dean, took a different approach. They acknowledged the obvious problems in their case from the opening statements. "We accept that something bad happened," Nielsen said, but they argued that without bodies, the jury couldn't know for certain that the 3 were dead, much less that they had been murdered, much less that Luis Toledo was responsible. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence directly tying Toledo to the actual act of killing. Yes, there was blood in the house, but the prosecution couldn't definitively prove how it got there or what happened to cause the bleeding. The confession was unreliable by everyone's admission. There was no forensic evidence showing exactly how the victims died because there were no bodies to examine. The defense suggested alternative theories. Perhaps Yesenia had killed the children and herself in some unknown location. Perhaps they had disappeared for reasons no one understood. Perhaps Toledo was being framed. It was a strategy of reasonable doubt, throwing out possibilities that might not be likely but were technically possible. Because somebody died doesn't make it murder. Doesn't make it second-degree murder. Doesn't make it first-degree murder. Dean argued, without knowing how the victims died, if they died, the jury couldn't convict Toledo of specific murder charges. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman prepared to read the decision. Luis Toledo was found guilty on all counts. He was convicted of second-degree murder in the killing of Yesenia Suarez. He was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of both Michael Otto and Thalia Otto. The distinction between the charges was significant. First-degree murder requires premeditation, planning, malice aforethought. The jury believed that the killing of the children had been deliberate and planned. The second-degree conviction for Yesenia suggested the jury believed her death, while intentional, may have been the result of passion or rage rather than premeditation. As the verdicts were read, Yesenia's family members in the courtroom embraced each other and sobbed. They were tears of relief, of validation, of grief finally acknowledged by the justice system. "We finally got justice," one family member said to reporters afterward. But it was a hollow kind of justice, wasn't it? Because Yesenia, Thelia, and Michael were still gone. Their bodies were still missing. The family still couldn't lay them to rest properly. They had a guilty verdict, but not closure. In November 2017, the jury reconvened to decide Luis Toledo's sentence. For the first-degree murder charges, the death penalty was on the table. Florida law allowed for capital punishment in cases involving the murder of children. The jury deliberated on whether Luis Toledo should be executed for his crimes. The decision was not unanimous. In the end, the jury recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of death. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation. Luis Toledo would spend the rest of his natural life in prison, with no chance of ever being released. He would grow old and die behind bars, never again walking free in the world where he had once been a high-ranking gang member, a husband, a stepfather, and finally a convicted killer. Today, more than a decade after Yesenia, Thelia, and Michael vanished from their home on Covent Gardens Place, their bodies have still never been found. This remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Where did Luis Toledo hide them? How did he dispose of 3 bodies so effectively that years of investigation and searching never recovered them? Did he have help? Given his former position in the Latin Kings, did members of the gang assist him in covering up the crime, even after he had testified against them? Central Florida is a complex landscape where bodies could be hidden. There are vast stretches of swampland where the Everglades ecosystem could reclaim almost anything. There are forests and rural areas where graves could be dug without witnesses. There are sinkholes and waterways. The possibilities are unfortunately numerous. Or perhaps Toledo had more sophisticated means at his disposal. Perhaps he used his knowledge of criminal operations to dispose of the bodies in ways that would make recovery nearly impossible. Perhaps they were moved far from Florida entirely. Luis Toledo has never revealed what he did with the bodies. If he truly killed them, as the jury determined beyond a reasonable doubt, he has taken the secret of their final resting place with him into prison. Whether this is his final act of control and cruelty, or whether some part of him simply cannot face what he did, we may never know. Every October, Yesenia's family gathers at the site, where the house on Covent Gardens Place once stood. They release balloons into the Florida sky, each one carrying a prayer or a memory. They look through photo albums, touching the images of a woman and 2 children frozen forever in time. Forever young, forever smiling in those captured moments before tragedy. Emily and Dino, a family friend, attends these memorials. "We come together to remember them," she has said, "to make sure they're not forgotten." There's something both beautiful and heartbreaking about this ritual. The family's refusal to let Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael fade into mere statistics, mere news stories, mere cold case files. In 2023, on the 10th anniversary of the murders, the gathering was particularly emotional. A decade is a long time to carry grief. A long time to maintain hope that someday, somehow, the bodies will be found and properly laid to rest. Children who were young when Yesenia disappeared are now adults. People have aged, moved on with their lives in the ways that people must. But still they return each October to remember. The Toledo family murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, about the warning signs we miss or ignore, about the systems that fail to protect vulnerable people. Yesenia told her family she was afraid of Luis. She had been assaulted at her workplace in front of witnesses. These were clear red flags, clear indicators that she was in danger. Yet she went home that night to the house she shared with the man who had struck her. Why? Perhaps because she felt she had no choice. Perhaps because she needed to collect belongings before leaving permanently. Perhaps because domestic violence victims are conditioned over time to minimize the danger they're in. The statistics on domestic violence are sobering. The most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries to leave. That's when an abuser's sense of control is most threatened, when their rage is most likely to turn lethal. Yesenia was trying to leave her marriage. She had started a relationship with another man. She was planning a separation. By doing this, by asserting her independence, she had unknowingly triggered a countdown to tragedy. And what of the children? Thalia and Michael were not Luis Toledo's biological children, but he was the man who had been their stepfather, the man who lived in their home. The first-degree murder conviction suggests the jury believed he killed them with premeditation. Why? To eliminate witnesses to Yesenia's murder, to inflict maximum pain on Yesenia before or during her own death, out of rage that they were the children of another man. We can speculate, but the mind of someone who could harm children remains ultimately incomprehensible to most of us. We cannot fully understand this case without considering Luis Toledo's past. His involvement with the Latin Kings, his rise to the third highest position in the Florida organization, and his decision to testify against the gang's leader all provide context, though not justification for what happened. Gang culture operates on principles of loyalty, respect, and brutal enforcement. Toledo had lived in that world, had thrived in it. When he chose to cooperate with prosecutors, he violated the most fundamental rule of that culture. He became what gang members call a rat, a snitch, someone who betrayed his brothers. Did this weigh on him psychologically? Did the stress of knowing he had made enemies of dangerous people affect his mental state in the weeks before the murders? And more disturbingly, did his gang connections help him dispose of the bodies so efficiently that they've never been found? Former statewide prosecutor Ann Wedge McMillan has noted that Toledo was a true insider in the organization, someone who understood its operations intimately. This knowledge, these connections, these skills learned in a criminal enterprise might have served him well in covering up his crimes. The Toledo case is also notable from a legal perspective as an example of a successful no-body homicide prosecution. These cases are notoriously difficult for prosecutors because the absence of a body means the absence of crucial evidence. Without a body, there's no definitive cause of death, no precise time of death, no physical evidence of the killing itself. The prosecution had to convince the jury that Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael were definitely dead, and that Luis Toledo definitely killed them, using only circumstantial evidence. They did this through a careful accumulation of facts. The blood evidence, the testimony about Toledo's behavior, the complete disappearance of 3 people who had every reason to maintain contact with loved ones. The timeline that placed Toledo with the victims at the crucial time. The confession, even though both sides ultimately agreed it was problematic, still played a role. A jury doesn't easily dismiss a defendant's own words, even recanted words. The image of Toledo saying Yesenia died looking at me begging for air is not something that can be unheard. The case stands as precedent for other no-body prosecutions. It demonstrates that with sufficient circumstantial evidence, a jury can be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that murder occurred even without the recovery of remains. What kind of person commits such an act? Forensic psychologists who study family annihilators, the term for people who kill their entire families, have identified certain patterns. These killers often feel a profound sense of loss of control. They may be facing the breakup of their relationship, financial ruin, public humiliation, or other circumstances that threaten their identity and status. For Toledo, the threats to his identity were multiple. He had already betrayed his gang and testified against them, which meant he could never return to that life. His marriage was ending. His wife had been unfaithful. He was facing the prospect of starting over. Possibly alone, possibly under threat from his former criminal associates, possibly humiliated in his community. Family annihilators often operate from a twisted logic, where killing loved ones is somehow preferable to losing them, or being abandoned by them. If I can't have them, the thinking goes no one can. There may also be a component of punishment, making the spouse suffer by killing their children, or eliminating children who would be witnesses or reminders of a failed relationship. None of this excuses the crime or fully explains it, but it provides a framework for understanding how a person could reach such a dark place. Deltona, like many communities that experience such a shocking crime, was forced to reckon with the fact that this could happen anywhere. This wasn't an inner-city neighborhood plagued by gang violence. Even though gang connections played a role, this was a suburban development, a place where families lived quiet lives. The neighbors who heard screaming that night have had to live with their own questions. Should they have called the police? Could intervention have saved the children, if not Yesenia? These are the kinds of questions that haunt people, that wake them in the middle of the night years later. The case also brought attention to the resources available for domestic violence victims in the area. In the aftermath, advocates renewed their push for better support systems, for more awareness of warning signs, for mechanisms to protect people who are in danger from intimate partners. At this moment, Luis Toledo is an inmate in the Florida prison system, serving 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He is now in his mid-40s, a man who will never see freedom again. What does he think about? Locked in his cell? Does he remember Thalia and Michael's voices, their faces? Does he think about Yesenia, about the life they had before everything fell apart? Does he feel remorse? Or has he convinced himself that what he did was justified somehow? And does he think about where he buried the bodies? The secret must be a burden, or perhaps it's the last thing he has control over. The final card he holds in a game where he's already lost everything. Prison records are public, though details of his daily life are not. He likely maintains some connections with family, though many families of convicted killers distance themselves over time. He may or may not still be in contact with anyone from his old life, either family members or former gang associates. What we know is this. Every day that he wakes up in his cell is a day that Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael don't wake up at all. Every year he ages is a year they don't experience. Every moment of his continued existence is bought at the price of their stolen futures. This case remains, in a fundamental way, unfinished, until the bodies are found, if they ever are. There cannot be complete closure. The Yesenia's family cannot hold a proper funeral. They cannot visit a grave. They cannot perform the rituals that humans have used for thousands of years to say goodbye to the dead. The children never got to grow up, to graduate from high school, to fall in love, to have their own children. Thalia would be in her mid-20s now. Michael would be in his early 20s. Instead, they remain frozen at 9 and 8 years old, forever young in photos, forever lost. Sometimes true crime cases wrap up neatly. The perpetrator confesses, tells investigators where the bodies are, explains what happened and why. There's a trial, a conviction, a sentence, and then the slow process of healing can begin for the survivors. But this case isn't like that. It's messy and incomplete. Justice was served in the legal sense, but the human need for closure remains unfulfilled. The question of where Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael are buried hangs over everything like a shadow. Maybe someday Luis Toledo will have a change of heart. Maybe as he ages and faces his own mortality, he'll decide to reveal what he did with the bodies. Maybe he'll want to make peace with what he's done before he dies. Or maybe he'll take the secret to his own grave, leaving the family to wonder forever. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you're safe in your bed, in your home, surrounded by whatever comforts you've built for yourself. It's easy to think of cases like this as aberrations, as things that happen to other people in other places. And statistically, that's true. Most of us will never experience anything like what happened to the Toledo family. But this case reminds us that evil can wear an ordinary face. That danger can live in suburban houses on streets with pleasant names like Covent Garden's Place. That the person you share a home with might be someone you don't know at all. It reminds us to pay attention to warning signs, to take seriously when someone says they're afraid, to intervene when we hear screaming in the night, even if we think it's not our business. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that every true crime case is about real people. Yesenia was not just a victim. She was a 28-year-old woman with dreams and fears and a life she was trying to improve. Thalia and Michael were not just statistics. They were children who loved their mother, who went to school, who had favorite toys and games and foods. They mattered. They still matter. And even though their bodies may never be found, their story will be remembered. Somewhere in Florida, beneath the ground or beneath water, or in some place we can't imagine, Yesenia Suarez and her 2 children rest. They are together, perhaps in whatever form death takes. Their suffering is over. Their fear has ended. But for those left behind, for the family that gathers each October to release balloons into the sky, the waiting continues. The hope persists that someday, somehow, they'll be able to bring Yesenia, Thalia, and Michael home. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.